Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this first session of the new year of the Colloquium Series from the Program on Education Policy and Governance, or PEPG. My name is Jim Pizer, and I'm your host for the day and for this semester. And glad to be here under the leadership of PEPG through Paul Peterson and Marty West, who's here to my right. We've got about a half a dozen speakers who are lined up for the course of the semester. The next one is actually not for another month, so March 12th. We'll be here in Taubman, but the subject is local school board politics. It's going to be featuring Vlad Kogan, the professor of Department of Political Science at Ohio State, or I guess I'm supposed to say the Ohio State. With a response from Scott Levy, who's an adjunct professor or lecturer, I should say, at the Graduate School of Education here, and who's also been an elected school board member in New York for many years. So I hope you'll be able to join us next month and across the rest of the semester for the other sessions. Today, we're lucky to have Lindsay Fryer, who's here to my left, straight from our nation's capital, although apparently arriving in the middle of the night here, today, under dark of night. Maybe that's the only way you can get here from Washington now.
Exactly.
And as you might have heard, there are a few changes going on in Washington and in the Department of Education in particular. And Lindsay is going to help us sort of make sense of all of that. And, there's maybe only so far you can go. But in terms of understanding what's going on both in the department and on Capitol Hill, and hopefully cut through some of the noise, of which there's obviously a lot, in order to understand kind of what the substantive shifts in policy might actually be. And Lindsay is a perfect guide for this complicated subject. She's president and founding principal of Lodestone DC, a policy and government relations shop with deep expertise in education and workforce development, among other things. And she's got deep experience working across party lines in Congress and in the executive branch. Importantly, she played a critical role in the drafting and enactment of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, the most recent authorization or reauthorization of the comprehensive federal policy or federal legislation governing K-12 education. Something that at the time a lot of people didn't think was actually possible, which sounds familiar, but it just means that things actually can get done. Perhaps more important, Lindsay also holds a master's degree in education policy and management from here at Harvard, and it's actually still on your bio on the website. So even under the current conditions, Harvard can still be out there. So we're going to structure today's session mostly as a conversation or a dialogue. So following some opening reflections from Lindsay, both on her career path as well as on the current climate in DC, I'll pose a few follow-up questions then to get the ball rolling, and then I'll kick it open or bring it open for the rest of the group here in person. Also try to work in folks who are online. So if you are watching online or through Zoom, please, as we're going forward, enter some questions into the comments if you want us to bring you in, and I'll try to work with Michael to incorporate some of those questions in the discussion. As always, this is recorded and will be posted on the website. So sorry to say, Lindsay, we're on the record. Keep that in mind. But with that, welcome, Lindsay, and I'll turn it over to you. Get us started.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's great to be back, although I wish it was a little bit warmer. Maybe I should have picked the spring date. But I'm excited to have this conversation. It's certainly timely. And I would say my time at Harvard in many ways was the jumping off point to my career in politics and education policy in particular. So, just big picture, the environment in DC has similarities and differences to where when I worked on the Hill to now. You can always count on DC for gridlock, filibuster, committee fights, fun talking points, and all that. But I think I'll delve into the environment, what it was like when we passed the last major education bill, which Jim referenced, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was 10 years ago, believe it or not. And I will use the framing of the 4 Ps, which will be familiar to many of you: people, process, politics, and policy, which all matter and interrelate in really important ways in terms of getting legislation done or not done, quite frankly. So I have to give credit to my old boss, Vic Klatt, for that. I did an adaptation of the 4 Ps. Not a trademark to him either. I know a lot of people use that, but I do think it's a very helpful framing to understand how things get done. So just thinking about the Every Student Succeeds Act, this isn't a story of nostalgia at all. It's really how those 4 Ps interacted to have everything aligned kind of in the perfect storm briefly at a point in time, which I don't think right now we have a similar environment to we did then. So I will talk about that and then where I see things going. But certainly want this to be a conversation. I want to make sure to get at the things that you all want to hear about. So I'll keep my remarks brief and then we'll jump into it. So as I mentioned, 10 years ago today, Congress passed the every 10 years ago, last December, December of 25, we passed ESSA. And that was the tagline that my boss at the time, who was Senator Lamar Alexander, the chair of the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, was we wanted to fix No Child Left Behind. And just to give you a sense of the numbers of how this passed, you had 85 senators voting in favor of the bill, 359 votes in the House, which are pretty unimaginable for something to have that kind of support in education these days. And we also moved the bill through what's called regular order. So we had a committee process where the committee members deliberated on the bill. We passed it through there. We passed it through the Senate floor, and then went to a conference committee. And the House also had that same process. So this was the last bill to move through regular order 10 years ago in education. And quite frankly, if you think about the things that have been happening in Congress, I don't think has been much regular order outside of education since then. Things just get done a little bit differently now. But at the time when this was happening, and the dialogue around fixing No Child Left Behind had been going on for probably about 8 or 9 years. This was 2014 when moved over to the Senate, actually took Marty's job. He was there helping to pave the way for what ended up becoming ESSA. We had serious bipartisan pressure at the time to get something done. And no matter what party you were, no matter what stakeholder group you were, everybody wanted to fix No Child Left Behind. And that was a major impetus for pushing Congress, who has to many times or should be answering to their constituents, to actually do something and put attention on this issue. And, the law was fundamentally broken, which is pretty rare for policy these days. You had a deadline in the law that by 2014, 100% of students would be proficient in math and reading. And as that deadline drew closer, we were in 2014, obviously that was not the case. And so the law had set up this series of sanctions that happened when schools were not meeting those particular goals. And that's where the problem then, where the law was fundamentally broken. So at the education secretary at the time was Arne Duncan, and he started to issue waivers of key requirements of the law, not dissimilar to where we are now, which we'll talk about, in exchange for states adopting reform. So many that will be familiar to you, getting rid of highly qualified teacher requirements to take on teacher evaluation systems, getting rid of sanctions in NCLB for states or districts adopting 6 turnaround strategies to fix your schools. And then the one that really was a political driver of getting this done, incentivizing the adoption of college and career ready standards that are common to a significant number of states, read Common Core, which became a very political issue. So when people undoubtedly started to push back against these reforms the administration was pushing, that created the environment for the dynamics under which we could get the law done. And so here's 4 things, I think, using those 4 Ps to pay attention to. You had extremely strong leadership in the Senate and House, particularly with Senator Lamar Alexander, who had an education background, and Patty Murray, who also had an education background, R&D, who vowed to work together to get this done. And it was President Obama's last year in office. He wanted an education legacy, so he was willing to cooperate with a newly Republican Congress to get this done. You had, and that's the people, you had Washington State's rejection of a waiver over the teacher evaluation system. The ranking member was Patty Murray from Washington, so she was hearing people from her state screaming about fixing the law. That was pressure from the left, and then you had pressure from the right, who was starting to hate Common Core. And get education out of the school. So again, the bipartisan coalition forming to put pressure on Congress to get things done. That was the politics. You had supportive leadership not only on the committee, which I mentioned, but Speaker Boehner at the time, then Speaker Ryan, Leader McConnell, who were going to give us space to have this education debate. And that also matters, like what you can actually have time for on the floor of the Senate or House. They were willing to give us that time. And they also read the politics of being favorable to get something done. That's the process. And then, as I mentioned, we had between 7 and 9 years of debate about what to do to fix No Child Left Behind. So there were the policies and policy ideas that we could put forth in the law, which mattered. So what my job was, I was the architect of the policy, the negotiator, and basically the air traffic controller. So I had to, for the Republican conference, I had to basically take the chairman's vision, put that into actual legislative language, negotiate line by line with the minority and Patty Murray's staff at the time, and then the House, and kind of anticipate and working with the executive about how they would regulate the law that would eventually get done. And then also the constant, can this pass 60 votes in the Senate? And this is where politics drives a lot stronger than policy. It didn't matter if I had 50 great ideas about education, if the entire Senate was not willing to, or 60 in the Senate were not willing to vote for it, I had to make sure to count votes constantly about what policy would be favorable. So, in the end, because of these circumstances, we held hands with the Democrats. We defended our bill. We had an extremely open process, which made my job very hard as a staffer. And what that means is every amendment that came forth, we were willing to consider. And you had Senator Alexander and Senator Murray agreeing to amendments that would be poison pills to the finely tuned negotiation and compromise we had crafted, them willing to vote against even their own things that they supported to keep that consensus held together. That's very different than a lot of leadership we see now. And the other thing is we had an agreement that all the four corners in the House and Senate would talk about the bill using a different set of talking points to make sure that we were keeping our party in line. The interesting thing about that is we'd have like a bunch of press interviews talking about the same bill. You would be like, is that really the same bill that you're talking about? Emphasizing different things. So that's how we were able to get the legislation passed, having this open process. And, so all that being said, you can see very clearly that the process is hard to get something done, particularly through regular order. And it's designed that way. I mean, we have a representative government and, it's really hard to get consensus on a lot of different things. And, people's views, extreme, moderate, mainstream, they're all represented. And so my job was to basically, how do we form this coalition to get something that could be tolerable to a lot of people? So we'll pause on that process and talk about what's going on today and what's similar and different. So I think then the members had a lot more respect for regular order. You also had a lot of the old guard, as I call them. There's been so many retirements in the last 10 years. There's a lot of new members of Congress that don't really necessarily care about regular order and getting things done. And, we had the committee markup, we had an open process, we had the conference committee. The minority party had a ton of leverage to ensure that their particular priorities would get into a final legislation. And so the regular order wasn't just procedural, it was relationships and relational. And now we have huge omnibus packages that you pile tons of policies together, thousands and thousands of pages. Members often don't know what they're voting on. The committees used to rule the day in terms of getting bills done. Now the leadership has a lot more say in terms of looking at the politics and figuring out what they can pass. So it's less of a policy debate, and I'd say more political. So I think that's one thing. That's the process. The policy, as I mentioned, you had a recognition from Republicans and Democrats that was time to relook at the federal role in education and a willingness to shift a little bit back towards the states. And, now I'd say federalism fights are sharper: immigration, SNAP, Title I conditions. The executive branch is very willing to test boundaries. That is not unique to this administration, just to be clear. I'd say since probably even before George W. Bush, you've had an executive that has pushed the limits of testing their powers and using executive order to enact policy. And so, that brings us to where the Trump administration is absolutely doing that thing. That's become the norm, I'd say. So that's policy. The politics, we had fatigue around ESSA getting done, as I mentioned. Now, parties are ideologically sorted. Extremes get a lot of airtime on social media. Compromise is oftentimes framed as betrayal. And so if you're not sticking to the most extreme position or what you platform or campaigned on, your constituents can sometimes turn on you, which I think is a different dynamic than we had. And social media really dominating the politics conversation. And then the last point is people. I'd say, policy at the time when I was there was written by staff who really wanted to solve a problem and were willing to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think my boss at the time was very much like, as long as I can say I got 3 to 5 really important things done and you, Lindsay, ensure that happened, we can live to fight the rest another day. I think that's different now. You have a lot of actors that are shaped by getting on the next news cycle. And so, that's very different. Fewer institutionalists, as I mentioned. Staff churn is extreme. The staff turns over so quickly. Like, I've been working on this one bill for less than a year, and I think I've had 4 different staffers, so I have to like kind of start from the beginning every time I talk to them on it. And the incentive structure now rewards messaging over actually legislating, so I think that's really important. So the question to me, and then we'll open up to the group, is not really about will we return to regular order, but what incentives would it take to change what's happening now? And as I mentioned, we're not in an unprecedented era. We are in many ways, but we also are not in many ways. The desire for press hits, the power of the executive, those are things that have always been true, but now I'd say they're heightened more so than when I was on the Hill 10 years ago. And so a couple of things that I'm looking at, are we in a permanent era of the executive branch really setting policy? What role do the courts play in all of this? A lot of things, the executives, Republicans, Democrats just test the limits of what they can do. The question gets thrown to the courts, and then the courts are the ultimate arbiter of whether or not something sticks. Can bipartisan coalitions still form around issues like workforce and career-connected learning and leave some of these bigger issues around assessment and accountability for another day? Does crisis create opportunity? Are we in an area of fatigue education? Certainly higher ed, and I know we're focused a lot on K-12 here, but there are massive reforms happening in higher ed that I wouldn't have dreamed about a couple years ago. And then what would a new ESSA-level coalition look like today? I think it would probably be different than 10 years ago, but those are the things that I'm watching in the work that I'm doing.
Terrific, so thank you. Helpful. So there's a lot there, and I appreciate the framing of it in sort of a grad school way. It helps us think about it. Hopefully it'll help people think about questions as well. Staying on Capitol Hill for a second, even though the environment seems kind of toxic and there's no way to get agreement and everyone's sort of focusing, I think, as you said, more on the messaging than the policy, and it's not following regular order, some things have actually been done. Mm-hmm. So in the K-12 space in particular, the new sort of federal scholarship tax credit mm-hmm. is a big deal. Now, it was part of a huge bill, and so maybe it was not really subject to the same kind of policy engagement that it would have been if it was a standalone. But nonetheless, that's a big shift in many ways. Obviously, workforce Pell and other sort of higher ed reforms that you referenced happened. And these were things that had been teed up in the prior Congress. So, I mean, there's actually, it seems like beneath the surface, there's some, I don't want to call it regular order, but some more traditional forward progress than you might otherwise be able to discern by reading the headlines. Anyway, mm-hmm. Just your thought about whether, in fact, things may not be as quote unquote bad as they seem, and whether there's still an opportunity to get things done.
So I think are things as bad as they seem is relative, right? You're exactly right. Things are getting done in DC. It takes a lot of time. It probably takes a lot more effort. You mentioned workforce Pell and the tax credit did not get done through regular order, though. That was a Republican-only policy that was passed through what's called budget reconciliation. So what I talked about, like the debate, the compromise, need bipartisan support, you don't need to do that in a budget process. And they pass reforms through dealing finagling mandatory money and the tax code. So it's very fascinating. Education is absolutely not getting done through regular order, which we mentioned. But the tax credit is a huge deal. And I think this is one area that I would watch pretty closely for a couple of reasons. And I have personal opinions on this, which I'm going to take the liberty of saying. I think this is not, to me, a debate about school choice and private schools versus public schools. This is brand new money that will be in the education space, not taking an existing dollar away from current systems, but brand new money that is going to happen for states that opt into this. Also, if you live in a state that does not opt in, you better believe that people will take advantage of the tax credit. And so what that means, they will donate to an SGO in another state, and dollars will be leaving your state to serve kids in other states if a governor doesn't opt into this. So I think that's important. And also, the attention around this does have to relate to, vouchers for private schools. Of course, that may be one use case in states, but that's not the only use case. That's probably the most established. But if governors, think about the opportunity opportunity, they can platform certainly and talk about how public schools can take advantage of this. I mean, I think one very obvious thing is around tutoring and direct supplemental services for families to make choices about what else they need. That is a huge, easy test case, I think, that could work. Public schools can set up these nonprofits to funnel the money to support initiatives that are in the public school space, after school programs associated with the school. I think there's a ton of opportunity here. So this is something to watch. I also would say the choice argument that the Republicans hang on, which is very popular, implementation matters a lot. But even in the states that have the most favorable choice policy, there is never going to be a situation where the majority of kids are leaving the public school system. The majority of kids will always be in the public school system. So I think, even in a blue state, if an SGO is set up for to provide money for private school tuition, it still is yet to be seen how much people take advantages, how much money are we talking about in the pot, will it actually make a difference? And so I don't think that it is the case where this creates a situation where the public school system is going to be left completely bereft. So I say those things because this is new money, and I think that's the most important point that matters. We all know that K-12 education, there's a lot to be desired for, and we need reforms, we need more resources, we need more thoughtful things that we know work. And so I think this creates a new funding stream, putting aside all the debates that I had to have 10 years ago. This is new money to play with, and I think governors can use the platform in whatever way they wish to highlight the things that are important to them.
So setting aside the legislative politics, if you will, there's a lot going on on the executive branch, just in terms of how the department is managed, structured, its staffing levels, its who's doing what. I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of perspective on how big the change really has been in the department, how different it is today than it was a year ago, and I guess maybe the other side of the coin is, has anyone noticed on the ground? Does it matter? Are schools still getting their money? And I mean, there's obviously been a number of, policy shifts and challenges, some of which are landing in the court, as you mentioned earlier. But just in terms of sort of the blocking and tackling of the work the department does on a day-to-day basis, is it very different than it used to be now? And do people notice on the ground? Yeah,
this is where the headlines dominating versus reality hitting the ground, I think, it's an important lesson. So by all counts, this idea of abolishing the Department of Education, downsizing it, is not new. It's been around since Reagan era, I think. But to this administration's credit, and something that they believe in, this is the first significant tangible steps I've seen for Republicans to actually do something here. And, back to the creative interpretation of the law and testing the limits, they're certainly doing that. At the very basic level, though, and this administration knows that they cannot get rid of the Department of Ed without a vote of Congress. Congress established the Department of Ed. You have to bipartisanly vote to get rid of it. I doubt that will happen. But the other thing that this administration is kind of maneuvering is Congress is still appropriating money for education. So whoever is doling out the money, Department of Labor, Department of Ed, the money still has to get out the door. So in terms of interruptions on the ground, my understanding is they're very minimal, but a couple of facts are true. So the administration came in once Secretary McMahon was confirmed, they got rid of, I think, about half the staff, off the bat, which was, dramatic in terms of headlines. To be honest, though, I mean, my interactions with them, they're very responsive. I've talked to states. They're we're not feeling any difference in terms of that being done. So, but there is a funny fact that doesn't hit the headline. So they got rid of half the staff as all right, kind of start from ground zero in a lot of things. They have been building back staff in particular areas where they're we need support. Federal student aid being one, NAG being NAEP being another. They're bringing back staff when they need to say, all right, we need expertise to do something. So I think that's an important thing that doesn't dominate the headlines. But here's another thing to watch. So what you mentioned, Jim, what the department is doing that's newer is these interagency agreements. Knowing that the department cannot fully offload their responsibilities to another agency, they are now going to jointly administer programs with, if you're talking K-12 or higher ed, the Department of Labor. So the biggest test case we have right now is the joint administering of the Career Technical Education Program, which moved from Ed to Labor. Way this happens in practice, staff are basically detailed from ed over to labor. So they're not reducing staff, they're just moving the expertise to the other agency. And, you know, to me, it's like, is this creating efficiency? Will this make things better? Yet to be seen. It's kind of like moving of the deck chairs exercise. So we're not getting rid of the money. We're not getting rid of the people with expertise. We might be moving them to a different building, but that's an important thing, like rhetoric versus reality. And the other thing I will say is, it is very hard for agencies to coordinate and talk to each other. Oftentimes they have their little fiefdoms and the things that they're in charge of. In some ways, this does force a conversation that wasn't as natural before. And the CTE example is really important. You know, the Department of Education administers Career Tech Ed. The Department of Labor administers Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act grants, which has a youth component to it. They've just now aligned the timelines for that states have to plan for this money to submit them together. So it is forcing this coordination that we haven't had, but you know, whether or not that matters on the ground, we'll see, right? So it's not a like crisis. It is a very real people problem, and certainly, you know, people that lost their job overnight, that's devastating, and I understand that. But in terms of services being interrupted, I've not seen that yet. In terms of where there were questions, they're bringing staff back. And the department, just one other quick thing, during the shutdown, they did try to take a further step and cut even more people. They probably went too far there, and then, you know, the courts, you know, came back and said no. And when they agreed to reopen the government, bipartisanly, both parties said actually undo what you did there. So you are getting bipartisan pushback on some of the limit to limit the powers of getting rid of the department, which I think is important. But overall, for now, I think services are kind of as they were. Yeah. That's not the same in the Institution of Education Sciences, the research arm, which I'm sure we'll get to. But overall, I'd say core money flowing, even with little blips of like threatening to withhold, it's getting out the door.
So one last question from me, and then we'll open it up. So at the outset, you talked about the ESSA process and how it was designed to fix NCLB, but it didn't sort of dismantle NCLB, right? It maintained the same sort of basic standards-based reform architecture of, you know, standards, assessments, accountability. Just, you know, had the federal government back off a little bit, if you will. Is that coalition that supported NCLB, that supported ESSA, does it still exist on Capitol Hill? Does it exist within the executive branch? If there was a stiff wind, would it all blow away? What's your take on the durability of that basic, you know, reform architecture as ESSA gets older and older?
Yeah. So the coalition that came together, I would say, doesn't exist at the federal level anymore right now, but that's also because there's not a live debate going on reforming ESEA. That was, you know, civil rights groups came together with the business coalitions and others to just say, like, all right, we got to fix this law, but we still need important federal guardrails. So that doesn't exist in terms of like loud advocacy necessarily. Like there's some fractions of it. I think the biggest thing that's interesting to me is the civil rights groups were so strong on maintaining assessment and accountability requirements to law, and I don't think they're in the same place now that they were. When I've talked to some of them, they've basically said, well, the assessment and accountability system has failed the most vulnerable students for over 20 years. Like, why should we keep talking about this? That could change, you know, again, if there were a live debate on this. So it's not the same coalition, but at the state level, there are live debates happening, like even today with legislatures being in session around if we should get rid of testing, for example. And you do see business, civil rights, others coming together to push back on that. So I think that's important. The other thing is this administration, you know, even though the mantra is returning education to the states, it's this with the waiver process where they're entertaining states writing in to say we want to do something different, get rid of some of these requirements in the law. It's not a free-for-all. They are holding the line on assessment and accountability. I've heard Assistant Secretary Baszler and her staff make statements around, you know, the reason we can return control to the states is because we have assessment and accountability. If we don't have objective measures of student achievement, how can parents, the public, policymakers make decisions about what's working or not? And so I don't believe that even in the era of waivers, you know, where we were 10 years ago, you'll see this administration let up on a lot of those things that were the finely tuned consensus. So if this were to be put up, if assessment and accountability were to be put up for a debate today, I would be honest, I would be concerned about its ability to pass. But you have the law, and the law is the law. It's not a live debate, and the institutional structures, including the department, which wants to return more control to the states, are holding the line on that consensus for now. So even though the coalition isn't there, the lines are still in place for sure.
Great, got it. Marty,
yeah, I want to jump in with one question. So one of the narratives that's out there about American politics in general and education in particular is that like Congress is not stepping up to defend its institutional prerogatives, right? And Republicans in particular aren't standing up to the Trump administration in this case. And that seems to capture a lot of what's going on. But when we look at education spending in particular, that doesn't seem to be the case. So the education budget just passed, new appropriations bill signed into law. The Congress basically, as far as I can tell, ignored the president's budget request and level funded most things. There were no major cuts to K-12 funding. So what do we learn from that? And I don't know, help us understand that, right? It seems like Republicans in Congress do whatever the administration tells them to in so many areas. Why does education spending look differently? Is it because of the connections to shutdowns and the pressure to get something passed?
Yeah. I mean, money is always really hard, right? Because I would say, to the point I made earlier about getting rid of staff of the department, not equating to disruptions on the ground, getting rid of formula dollars for education would absolutely have disruptions. So I think this is like a lesson in politics a little bit, and then process and how maneuvering behind the scenes matters. So I do think it's fair to say that Congress has the power of the purse. Spending originates and ends with Congress, and the agencies are supposed to spend the money that Congress gives them in the manner that Congress directs it to. When this administration, initially started to test some of those limits, you didn't see a lot of public outcry from Republicans. You saw a little bit, but not a huge public outcry to stop it. But then, to your exact right point, they passed a budget that outrightly rejected block granting, massive cuts to education. They didn't block the interagency agreements from happening, but they basically said, we don't think you do it.
Doing it anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They said, we don't agree with this, and also we're going to be watching what you're doing. So I think that is Congress reasserting itself, even if they didn't do it in the manner that people would have liked to see, like the public debate in the media, right? And that's kind of the point I was making now earlier. The public debate in the media, like getting at odds with the administration, puts a target on many members' backs. But at the end of the day, if you're voting in a block to like reject something, it's a much easier thing, I think, to put on the table. So ultimately, the other point is Congress, needs to fund the government in order for it to operate. The politics of shutdown are very bad. And so at the end of the day, in order to get something done in funding, you need to have bipartisan support. And so the Republicans are like, all right, we got to play ball. What are we hearing from our people on opening the government and money and services being interrupted? The shutdown was more interrupting than anything the administration had done prior. So that forces them to say, what's the negotiation point here? And level fund without exploding the education budget, tinkering here or there with member priorities around charter schools. I mean, the charter schools got a big bump. They can get wins without having to be fully disruptive and stake their position and claim, not as an individual, but as a voting bloc of party. So the Republicans did reestablish their responsibility to fiscally fund the government without having to put a target on their back. And that's, again, you don't have to debate it in the media to make a statement. I think that's very instructive.
Questions? Yeah,
just shifting gears a bit. I'm David. I'm a Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. Shifting gears a bit to higher education, I was curious how you viewed the Trump administration's targeting of certain higher ed institutions, Harvard being one of them. Do you see this more as a new coherent policy towards higher education institutions, or is it more of a personal vendetta? And is there the risk of, let's say, in the next Democratic administration, they could say to, University of Texas, if you don't have DEI initiatives or if you don't have a diverse student body, we'll cut funding to you? What is sort of the direction you see this moving in?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's a different type of federalism, right? That you have an executive that's very willing to use their powers to put forth a position or incentivize, coerce, whatever word you want to use, different behavior change. So is this, I would say the sentiments around higher education have been questionable for some time. Republicans kind of lopped onto the culture war, higher ed is woke, too liberal, like not open to the conservative voice, and use that, which they saw as like politically popular, and use the tools at their disposal to go after certain institutions. Is it a personal vendetta? That's not my impression. I think it's like, where are the politics favorable and where are they seeing gains with people, with grassroots that they care about? And so that's where kind of, and what institutions do they want to use to make an example to others? So, Harvard certainly is caught up in this debate currently. But kind of back to the original framing, I don't think that this is uncommon of executives, right? The Biden administration did everything in their power to forgive student loans, right? And like, arguably, things that were not allowed by law, the courts ultimately said, they were not allowed by law. So it's just a different focus point than using different priorities. So like, does this stand moving forward? I think, well, this administration came in hot, they had an agenda, they went full board. The courts have said, pull back on some of this. I do think that they'll continue on this, maybe not as in loud of a manner, but more discreet, like what are they seeing as egregious behavior to go after that? But like the whole, like capturing the headlines constantly on this, I think that probably lessens a little bit. But I am absolutely concerned, like what happens in the next administration, right? We are continuing to like push the bar on the executive doing what they want to do. Congress not getting a whole lot done, right? You can barely keep the government funded these days. So it is absolutely a very important question to me, who supports federalism, about the power of the executive and what's to come next. And so yeah, I am concerned, and I do think that we are just in this era where that's kind of becoming the norm. And who knows what the next administration's priority will be, R or D, right? So that is a very important question, and I think it's something to watch for sure.
If you could, I'm Antonio, I work here at the program. If you can, administrations come and go, but the Supreme Court has just a longer lifespan. Mm-hmm. What should we be looking at in the future as different administrations sort of push the envelope, cherry pick what they like, don't like, what they want to change, and the flavor of the Supreme Court that we have now that might allow some things or might take back some things? What are the things that we can?
Yeah, I mean, it also is back to an original point about the courts really being
right,
the policymaking arm in so many ways. And like, as a little bit of an aside to that, one of the problems with the executive asserting so much power through executive order, through regulation, is you have this pendulum swing back and forth. Like take in higher ed the gainful employment regulation, which targeted for-profit schools in many sense. We've seen that be aggressive, be pulled back, be put back in place, be pulled back, right? And schools are like, what are we even supposed to do on this? We now have a new iteration around ROI around that. So one of the problems with Congress not doing their job through legislating by having more staying power is you're going to have this pendulum. I don't see that changing. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, we used to have these massive reauthorizations, which I was a part of 10 years ago. Maybe we shouldn't have that anymore. Maybe you pick discrete issues, of which there probably is a lot of bipartisan agreement, workforce Pell being one of them. They probably could have gotten that done bipartisanly, and start pushing the envelope there rather than saying an all or nothing approach to reform. So the court's decision have a ton of staying power. And so as long as this Supreme Court is its makeup, I think these types of decisions we're seeing are going to continue. I don't see a lot of reversals on that until the Supreme Court turns over. But I do think this also gets at your question, like this administration's pet projects, prior administration's pet projects, it's just going to swing back and forth, like hit or not. And that's a problem.
But the court that we have now is very different than the court that we had, let's say, even 2 years ago.
That's right.
Like fundamentally different.
That's right. And their decisions have staying power, for sure.
Other questions?
So you just mentioned gainful employment, and one of the things I've been struck by, so this was a approach to regulating and providing accountability for higher ed institutions, trying to sort of hold them accountable for the earnings of their graduates, and they could lose their ability to have Title IV aid, federal student aid, if they didn't meet certain metrics. This was introduced by the Obama administration over cries of outrage from Republicans in many cases, who thought it was, an assertion of executive power that was improper. But also they tended to sort of oppose the idea. They thought the federal government shouldn't be extending sort of new accountability into the higher ed sector, which they were very protective of in many cases. But you just mentioned, like, now we have a Republican administration responding to a Republican law, introducing new outcome-based accountability metrics. And that just strikes me as like a huge shift in about a decade of where Republicans were. What explains that? And again, what do we learn from it?
So it's a really good point. And I think it stems back to what I said around like sentiments around higher ed, costs exploding, like tuition on the rise, like people not being able to get jobs, or at least not getting jobs that are giving them a salary that matches what they actually paid for school. So in some ways, like the politics, like I think have shifted around the higher ed sentiment. The other thing is Republicans were very opposed to the gainful employment because it was basically 2 laws and statute that turned into hundreds of pages of regulation that they thought was inappropriate interpretation.
2 words in statute. Yeah,
Sorry, 2 words in statute. Yeah. That and it targeted a specific sector. The Republicans' position for a long time, even when I was on the Hill, was, well, accountability should be for everybody. That's where we are right now. Right now, an earnings test that applied to everybody equally. So I think just this idea of like, what if we're spending money for a purpose, like what is the value of that, right? What is the value of a higher education? Is it going to lead to better jobs, better earnings throughout your lifetime? And so they're now using that as a test to answer that question. Whether or not it's appropriate, it's a very blunt object, quite frankly, just looking at earnings, but whether or not it's appropriate, it's injected this new debate into higher ed, which programs are going to have to think about at a program by program level. And I would say, while Republicans have done this alone, and they'll have to own it alone, depending on the consequences, Democrats are not fully against this either. I've heard a lot of them talking about accountability for higher ed for very similar reasons to Republicans, even if they come at it from a different angle. Well, and the rules that have just come out on this were a product of consensus, where negotiators all together said, we think this is right, from the left and the right. So hopefully it has some staying power, and we'll see. But I just say that the tide and sentiment around higher ed, getting tons of money through loans with very little accountability is just different. In some ways, we're kind of pushing where K-12 was, right?
I'm realizing we've also seen this demographic shift in terms of education and where more educated voters situate themselves between Republican and Democratic Party, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kathy. I work at Avella. We build a platform for school access and choice. My question is actually around when you were working on ESSA, how did research play into the policy part of things? And then what happened when the politics came in, and has that changed?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I know Marty and I talk about this a lot. So my first job actually was a researcher. I come from a research background. When I came to Capitol Hill, my first portfolio was IES, the research portfolio. So I did have a lot of bright ideas about, of course, evidence drives decision making. Of course, we need to infuse what we know works into policy. So I don't, and that is not necessarily the case. Marty and I both had a much different background than a lot of staffers on Capitol Hill who don't understand research findings and their applications. I'd say, unfortunately, from what I've seen, is oftentimes staffers just pick whatever research supports the opinion that they already have. So research as a driving force for change is not always the case, but it's not completely void of research either. I think statistics matter, numbers matter, particularly if you're equating program impacts in terms of number of people, economic gains, all the things that we're talking about in higher ed. People want to know those things, and research can give you those answers. So I'd say the way that I see research working is like research brings to light a lot of problems, which then you have to find a solution for. Whether or not research drives the solution, not always the case, right? It's what's the public sentiment, where do voters want something, like what's popular. That's definitely more important than like pure research. And again, you can find research to support whatever claim that you have. So there is a lot of cherry picking that happens. I don't know, Marty, you probably have thoughts on this too, but
a couple thoughts. I think you're right that it's very rare that like you see research findings going directly into influencing a decision about legislative language or a policy choice. It's usually a more indirect process. And it happens really by shaping what people are talking about in the relevant stakeholder community. Like, that's one point. So it's more of a longer process. And then the second thing I would say is that oftentimes research is influential in the sort of questions it asks or the way it frames issues rather than as much as the findings. So a good example of that is this whole issue of FAFSA simplification, which was an issue that your former boss worked on and became very excited about, simplifying the federal financial aid form. That was directly responding to research that some of our colleagues here, Sue Dynarski and Bridget Terry Long and others had done, where I think what was important about that is they shifted the question that policymakers were asking when thinking about the FAFSA. So before their work was done, I think the lens policymakers brought to that was, how do we make sure that federal aid reaches exactly the right students and not one student who has a trust fund hidden somewhere, ends up with a Pell Grant. And if you really try and solve that problem as completely as possible, you end up with a 500 question form that then itself acts as a barrier to other people. Well, these researchers said, no, we should be asking, like, what design of this form best allows us to facilitate college access? And just asking that question sort of shifts how you go about that process. So that's just like one example of how research can matter.
Maybe just piggybacking on this a little bit, seems to me the most prominent research-driven policy shift has been around reading. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily the research, but the sold a story, narrative about it or storytelling about it that made the difference. Because in some ways the research has been out there for many decades, which is all to say that I think there's some combination of research and communication and having the right people and asking the right questions, et cetera, that can make it valuable. But this is a good transition to ask about IES. You mentioned that earlier. What's your current take on its status, on its, there was certainly a lot of conversation about reforming how IES does its work. Are we in a reform space, or are we just, in a cut, slash and burn place?
So I'm hopeful on this conversation, actually. But back to this point we're just talking about, I mean, research absolutely does have a communications problem, like getting the right people to talk about it in a way that is understandable and then can be scaled and put into practice is a problem, which IES has tried to solve, and probably there's a lot, we can do a lot better there. So just candidly, not a lot of things surprised me in DC. I was very surprised. I told Jim this about the initial come in and like wipe out of IES. I kind of was like a little more like, let's see what Doge is going to do. Like, this is interesting. Of course, there's things like fiscal responsible things and better decision making. They came in and they were like whack, like almost the majority of the budget was gone and the majority of the staff was gone overnight. But again, a lot of those contracts have been restored. Staff, I would say certainly not the majority of staff have come back, but in areas where they needed additional support, they're bringing people back. However, I think one of the reasons that we haven't seen a lot of activity out of IES was, one, because there's not a lot of staff there, but two, the administration was literally like, asking the question, what research has IES produced that's ever helped anybody? That's their framing of it. I don't think it's fair, but, researchers did have a tough time answering that question in a way that satisfied them. And so this department said, we're going to take a pause on new money going out the door, or like reinstating a lot of the canceled money, and let's actually think about reforming IES. They brought in a person, Amber Northam from the Fordham Institute, to tackle that question for the better part of a year. And so there's two things moving forward that matter. The report is now in the hands of the leadership. They've told me that they will make it public at some point. So we will see what all that effort over time yields. And she did talk to tons of stakeholders, got a lot of input about answering these questions, like how do we improve IES? So I think we have that report, which will be the platform for the second point, getting money out the door. IES was just fully funded again, despite the complete wiping out of a lot of the contracts that were in place. So the administration does have to get that money out the door. And I think they plan to, albeit maybe in different ways than we've seen. So I think that we will see I don't know if revival is the right word, but like a return to getting money out the door through IES. Programs might look different than we've been used to. You might have new actors being able to play in the space that might not have been considered before, new priorities, but, and we'll see what Amber's report says when it comes to light. But I do think that there's a lot to be hopeful for there, and at least a very serious look at if we're going to invest in this space, which arguably I'd say research is one of the most important federal roles in education. Like, how do we make that better and more usable and more practical? And keep the quality from where it was. Like, no one can debate that the quality of research has greatly improved through IES. Now we have to look at the usability, I think, a little bit more and not compromise the quality. So it's a very hard question to answer, but I do think that we'll see some movement in this area in the coming months.
Other questions?
I have another one.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. You talked about, when ESSA passed 10 years ago, there was sort of this confluence of the 4 Ps, and now like post 2015, moving forward, there's sort of been this, introduction of the culture war issues more so than there was in the past. So do you see in this sort of polarized climate, another consequential education bill passing at the federal level outside of, let's say, the reconciliation process? To me, it seems very unlikely.
Yeah.
If you agree.
It's a great question. Unlikely for sure right now. We don't have those confluence of the 4 Ps that you correctly reference. And even like the dominating headlines around ed being around the culture wars, there's not a federal legislative fix really, in my opinion. Even Republicans, I think, are wary of being like, all right, parent involvement in education, like, what are we going to do? Pass a law mandating like 2 parent-teacher conferences a year? There is a bill, by the way, that does that, but that is like, there's not going to be that. That's a very that the federal role, I think, is like it doesn't. There's no federal answer to a lot of the questions that are on the table right now. This is where the waiver process becomes instructive. So like 10 years ago, when Arne Duncan's waivers like started to have political heat, they were used as the impetus to reform the law in ways that rejected a lot of those policies. We've now had the administration open the waiver window back up and say, all right, states, give us ideas about things that you want to change around federal law. Let's see what comes out of it. Maybe that will be the basis. And if a lot of states are coming in around the same thing, the basis that reforms the law. But I don't see the politics. I don't see the need, really. I mean, the law is incredibly flexible. States have not taken advantage of a lot of the flexibilities that exist. So maybe do that first. And so to the last point, like where we had answers to a lot of the things that were broken 10 years ago, what's broken? I don't think we know, and we certainly don't have the solution if we don't even know what the problem is yet. So I don't think we're yet ripe for another reauthorization. And the law doesn't have this like hard deadline that it did. So does it need to be fixed? I don't know. I mean, when Alexander left, he's like, we don't ever need to reauthorize this law again. I don't think that's like necessarily the case, but I have not seen the consensus around what changes need to happen, if any. Like, let's kind of test the boundaries first and figure out how states can make better decisions and do things different before we mess with the federal law. Higher ed.
I think a little depends also on, in both higher ed and K-12, and you mentioned this a moment ago, the extent to which Congress and the leaders in Congress are willing to consider pulling discrete components out of these very large bills, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act or the Higher Education Act, and pass them separately when there's a consensus to sort of make a change in one area. when I was there in 2013 and 14, we were in like a total gridlock situation, and I like wanted to do things. So I was always arguing, well, we have this like new charter school bill that we could take out of the broader law, and why don't we just pass that? Like there's bipartisan support for it. And Senator Alexander, his argument was, well, if you take all the like popular parts out of the law, like you're left with just the rest, and you'll never be able to get the rest done. And he may have been right, but eventually, but there are examples where that has happened. So,
well, and if you look at student loan policy, that's all been done through reconciliation. It's mandatory money, right? And so the major changes to student loans have all been done through a piecemeal approach. And so I guess that's like pretty instructive. I guess, you know, there is this question of like, you take out the sweet stuff, what's the leverage to get the broad thing done? Maybe we don't need to get like the broad thing done necessarily. Maybe some of these discrete pieces are enough of a, like push the ball forward in certain areas that like that, and that matter to real people. Like, why not do that? I do think the sentiment around the big reauth is changing. I've heard my former colleagues like now willing to talk about it, whereas before they were like, how dare you bring that up, right? I do think the sentiment's changed quite a bit.
So could I ask you a 4P question, maybe?
Sure.
Or maybe more of a political science question. So I can imagine you talk about regular order, and if you could flick a switch and go back to a regular order where committees actually were the dominant, sources of power and action on Capitol Hill, and they were focused on particular issue areas, and they had a certain sense of ownership and responsibility for them, and therefore they kind of took their work as legislators seriously. I can imagine, the culture shifting and kind of moving back in a direction that's a little more, or a little less, I don't know, toxic, hyperbolic, whatever it might be, but a little bit less about the messaging and more about the policy. But it seems to me you can't flick that switch as long as the politics are what they are, and maybe to your part about the generational shift, as long as the people are who they are, who have been shaped by that political environment. Anyway, this is a long, complicated question, but how do we get out of this box to get back to something that either looks like the regular order procedurally, or is actually in practice more like it? Or are we just doomed to be in this position forever?
Yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's kind of the conversation that we were just having. Discrete policy solutions that everybody agrees on, the willingness to like break down issues, and where I started with all this, the willingness to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? That sentiment is just different, and social media is hugely to blame for a lot of this. It wasn't as prevalent 10 years ago. So I don't know. I mean, there are regular order processes happening. The House just passed, the House Republican Committee just passed, Education Committee just passed charter school bills. Again, they're taking discrete issues, and I'm seeing that more and more. So maybe there has to be a willingness to tackle things that maybe aren't as like sexy in the press, or like a willingness to compromise, when you get elected. It's a very hard question. I don't know the answer to, but I think it starts with strong leadership. And like Alexander and Marie were like, we will get ESCA done. We absolutely will do this. And you have the president being like, I want a legacy, right? So you need kind of the leadership to coordinate. And when they've done it, even like with the Trump administration, we have seen deals being made, right? So I think, without having like the perfect answer to your question, it's like, all right, a recognition of like what are actually the problems that are super broken that we need to fix that are like the good of all, and like focusing on that and leaving the rest to fight another day. But the process is just by nature very hard. And I also think that we do have a divided country. Like, let's just be candid about it, right? You have extremes, and members represent the extremes. So like by nature of that, it creates this deliberative process that's hard to drive consensus. There's also like, there used to be like a lot of carrots to like, with earmarks to give members like money for their pet projects in their particular areas. We have that a little bit now, not as much as we did 20 plus years ago. So maybe Congress can figure out ways to like incentivize themselves in member behavior in different ways, but that also says that they have to recognize it, the institution itself needs to reform. And I am not a proponent of like getting rid of the 60-vote bill filibuster, by, like, for example, but something else. Is there other incentives they can put in place to make members legislate?
So maybe it's, picking the low-hanging fruit and getting some wins, if you will.
Showing the process can work. Yeah, that's fair.
The other thing that just occurs to me is just whether members of Congress are enjoying this or whether they hate it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have record numbers of retirements on both sides. I do think a lot of people who were like used to more regular order are kind of like, I'm done, right? Which then brings in new people who are like using the media savvy and like don't necessarily want to make a deal or get elected by making a deal. So it creates a hard environment. So yeah, I think it's a tough environment for members and staff. That's why we see the churn that we do. So like, what's going to give to change behavior? I'm not quite sure. I guess we'll just have to see a little bit. The other thing I would say too is the outside voices actually matter a ton. Like I hear all these complaints about like, no one cares what I have to say. I'm just a teacher. I'm this, I'm that. Like, I don't actually think that's true. I mean, if you're looking why the administration, this one and the prior one has lopped onto issues like loan forgiveness and culture wars, it's from the bottom up where this was created. And so I'd say individuals exercising their voices, like making noise about issues in the press, forces Congress to act. And like, that is not a point that's lost to me. I mean, I'm in the DC fray and sometimes you forget this, but like real people making a stink matters a ton. It mattered as one of like the 4 Ps in us getting ESSA done 10 years ago. And it's driven the process. Like choice exploding, like has now translated up to the federal level at the states. The idea of more skills-based training and using federal aid dollars for that obviously is translated up. So people using their voices and making noise actually does drive decision making too. So maybe having more people engage more directly in the process of policymaking would matter too.
Yeah. Other questions? Maybe one concluding one then. We have an election coming up. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but there's some assumptions or maybe a conventional wisdom that there are going to be some shifts potentially, certainly in the House around who's in the majority.
Mm-hmm.
How big a deal do you think that, if that happens, let's say, for the sake of argument, the Senate remains Republican, but maybe less so, and the House, becomes Democratic, but still in a tight margin. How will that change what happens? Because in some ways you could say, well, okay, now they kind of have to work together.
Mm-hmm.
In others, the gridlock, in other perspectives, the gridlock can become even worse. But what's your kind of take for the importance of this, certainly when it comes to education policy, but maybe more broadly?
So I love this question. I love divided government. I actually think it makes the process work better because right now, like the Republicans own everything. They live and die by like the consequences of their actions, right? And so I think when we passed ESSA, we had a Republican Congress and a Democrat president. It kind of forces people to prioritize things, leave the like margin fringe issues aside and like, all right, let's focus on the meat of the conversation. So when you have a divided government, people have to bring their like best foot forward to get something done. So I think history is pretty instructive on this too. I think most major RIAs, at least in ed, had divided government when they actually got done. So I think that's really instructive. And so it could be a driver to like, reopen the debate, like a voter rejection of like the purely Republican platform, bringing in some Democrats, like let's mix it up a little bit and start to like see if we can break some of the logjam, which is counterintuitive, but it's actually true. Like when you are forced to listen to the other side, like, and they have a dominating like control mechanism in one chamber, it creates this dialogue to happen where like incentives and change can occur. In terms of education, I think about this question a lot. Like the polls show, like, does education matter in terms of voters? It like ebbs and flows in terms of importance. Like I live in Virginia, which is an off-cycle state elections. It mattered a ton in the governor's race 4 or 5 years ago. Not so much in like the existing one, but I think that, like the thing that I watch on education is the economy. And if the economy, there's clearly a connection between education and the economy. And so depending on the state of the economy, And if you say, okay, the economy is bad, people don't have jobs, people don't have skills to fill those jobs, where does it all start? That's where education enters the conversation pretty directly. AI, I think, will change this conversation drastically. I know Harvard's talking about that a lot. So to me, it's not like education on the ballot, but like the economy on the ballot and the solutions to fixing the economy have an education component to it. So if like candidates lop onto like what their solution is, that's where education fits into the ballot, not as its own issue, but as part of an economic discussion, which I think is important and good. And I have real questions about like the future of ed and what it looks like given the tools that we see at our disposal that are changing every single day. So I do think it will be on the ballot, even if indirectly. And I'm hoping that Congress recognizes that kind of what we're doing, the status quo isn't necessarily working. Whether or not it's a federal solution or empowering states to make different choices more easily, yet to be seen. It's probably a combination of both, but we have really existential questions, I think, to answer in the coming years about ed. And there's a lot of smart people here and elsewhere that can answer that. So I'm looking forward to being part of that debate. And
do you think there's anything that's teed up, sounds like the wrong word, but sort of waiting in the wings that might move if there were, and this would probably not be a reauthorization of ESEA, but, a smaller, maybe best case scenario, low hanging fruit piece of legislation that might actually get some attention that wouldn't otherwise.
So it's not the traditional like accountability assessment arguments. What's catching a ton of steam bipartisanly is the use of technology in various forms, like in the classroom, student data privacy, social media, regulating third-party companies. That is dominating the conversation, even with an education spin in Congress. AI too, to some extent. Education in itself and AI hasn't gotten a ton of focus, but that is now catching steam. I think you've had both education committees have multiple hearings on this. So that is the lane to watch on policy. Privacy, ed tech, AI, and like what's the federal role in that versus like third parties, how to regulate that. That to me is ripe for something, and I think we'll have to have an answer to that in the coming years.
Great. All right, with that, Lindsay, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you all back here in a month, March 12th.
That'll be a good topic. Gerrymandering.
Yes, again.
I agree with you. One of my takeaways was the problem is not a lack of responsibility.